Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen if that's okay. If you can give me hosting privileges, who's ever, can you see my screen? Great, thanks. So hi everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation and for organizing all of this. I really do appreciate it. It's very nice to join you all this Sunday morning from Ottawa. And so I'm going to speak to you a little bit about my personal experiences with disability and also tell you just a little bit more about the field. I'm going to start with another land acknowledgement because it's really important. And so I acknowledge that I live, work, and create on the traditional and unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. I recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the watersheds of the Kitchsiba, Ottawa, Gatineau, and Mattawa rivers for generations. I have lived all but 4 years of my life on stolen Indigenous lands, first in Takaranto, home to the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit. As immigrants fleeing from persecution, this land has meant freedom and safety and possibility for me and for my family. But our presence here has also contributed to the ongoing occupation of Indigenous land. And so I understand my role as a settler and educator is to support and carry out the work of reconciliation, and more importantly, to decolonize in the many different communities I belong to. So I'm committed to this work in my teaching and my research, and to also a decolonizing that extends beyond Turtle Island and attends to the consequences of colonialism in other parts of the world. The image you see on the screen here is Kent Monkman's Miss America, and it really tells us that in no point in history on this continent is there an event that is not connected to the land. Every figure, every piece of this is part of American and Canadian history, and Monkman refuses to separate that from the land. If you look closely enough, all the way back there next to the Aztec pyramid, you'll see remnants of a very popular, very famous building. I don't know if anyone can recognize what the remnants of that building are. If anyone wants to unmute and share their thoughts.
That's the towers.
It's the towers. It's the 9/11 towers precisely. And so even that history, Monkman suggests, is connected to various forms of colonization and decolonization. Thank you, Bev. So story time. My name is Fady Shanouda. I am an assistant professor at Carleton University, and I do research on disabled, MAD, and FAT experiences. And mostly my area of focus is on access to higher education. So I have a PhD in public health sciences from the University of Toronto, and I also have a master's degree in critical disability studies from York University. I use he, him pronouns, and I identify as a disabled, queer, fat person of color. So these intersections of disability and sexuality and size and race, they've shaped my life in more than one way. I want to start the session by really telling you a little bit more about me. One, because I think it's important for you to know where I come from and how I understand disability and all its intersections. And two, because ableism and saneism, which are systems of oppression that really discriminate against people who have different bodies and who think and act differently, who might have different minds. They're really there are really different ways of thinking and understanding and conceptualizing the world that really work in tandem with other systems of oppression. So things like racism and sexism and homophobia and queer and transphobia and xenophobia, all of these things work together to shape particular people's lives. So my story will hopefully shed light on how these systems are interconnected and how hard it is to decipher which is at work in our everyday experiences and exchanges. So this story is really an example of the term intersectionality. So My story of disability starts when I was 9 in grade 3. At the time, I was a rambunctious kid. I was also big and tan, and I presented as more feminine than my male peers. So as a big tan femme body, my big tan femme body attracted lots of attention from my teachers. My third grade teacher eventually sent me to see a psychologist after noticing I had difficulty reading and writing. And so I was subsequently diagnosed with a learning disability. This meant I spent large parts of the school day away from my classroom and peers in a resource room where I could receive focused support to improve my reading and writing skills. I stayed in special education up until the end of my high school, but I continued to seek support throughout my university career. In the many years since, I've reflected deeply on what caught the teacher's attention that led her to request a psychological consult. In my over 10 years of study, I've come to learn that it was not just one thing, one difference that led to an increased surveillance of my body and my mind. It was all of the differences, all the ways my body-mind veered away from some expected form of normalcy, whether that expected normalcy was around my reading capacity, my gender expression, the size of my body, or even the level of melanin in my skin. I wonder what would have happened if I looked or acted differently. Would I have been sent to a psychologist? How did ableism, racism, fat phobia, and homophobia structure that teacher's decision, even subconsciously? I won't ever be able to answer these questions fully, but I do know that asking them has helped me understand the harms those normative expectations can have on those of us who live outside socially produced standards. So the concept of intersectionality is an analytical tool. It has allowed me to consider the impacts of these systems on my life. Some of this reflection has also meant that I understand my very deep privileges. I am white passing. I can pass as someone without a disability. I grew up middle class. I grew up supported by my family. My privileges are quite incalculable. And so another person telling you this story may have had a very different experience without those privileges. Another important reason I'm telling you this story is to pop the bubble around disability and inspiration. At this time, you might be thinking, yeah, growing up might have been challenging, but you're a professor now, so it can't have been all that bad. Or, wow, you're disabled and a professor, you're such an inspiration. And I really do urge you to confront those thoughts. Importantly, you should know that it's not uncommon to have those thoughts. We've in fact been told to simply think of disabled people as forms of inspiration. It's expected that you think these ways, that you respond to those ways, to these stories. But disabled people, or any really marginalized person who is successful, should not be reduced to an inspiration, to be used really in comparison to other people's experiences. That's really not fair to the disabled people who didn't have my privileges growing up. And my accomplishments shouldn't dismiss the many challenges or barriers that I had to fight to get where I am. So I always think, I may have reached my professional goals, but how much easier could it have been without having to experience all of the barriers that I did? And so even our responses to my stories, I think, are ones that reflect these systems, ableism, insanism, and racism, etc. They are so powerful and are ingrained in our many systems, our cultural systems, our social, political, and economic systems. We are what's called inculcated, or really baptized in these systems in different degrees. The best thing is that you're coming to really unlearn these things together, which is so wonderful because often people have to do this alone. And so what's great about doing this is that you have the support of your community, you have the support of each other in going through this kind of process of trying to understand how you've also been part of these systems, contributed to them, and doing that together is really a wonderful way to not have to do this alone. So how I came to unpack my experience was really through learning about the field of disability studies, or sometimes called critical disability studies. So what is the field? Well, you've all come across disability. You may be disabled or experience disability or various forms of ableism. You may have family members or friends who are disabled, and each of us relates to disability one way or another. And if not now, certainly in the future, disability will become part of our lives. And so how we understand individuals with body-mind differences is essential to our survival, our collective survival and growth as a species. And so disability studies provides us with a different way of understanding disability than from the mainstream. It's about a 40-year-old emergent field of study that examines the experiences and processes of what we now call disability. It's easier really to answer the question what disability studies is by telling you what it is not. It is not the study of disabled people or of specific medical diagnoses. It is not about finding cure or other medical forms of intervention for disabled people. We do not do research for disabled people or on disabled people. It is therefore the study of the kind of social and cultural phenomenon of disability. And here I kind of show you two images of how we see how disability is really present in all these different ways in our social and cultural spheres, even when disabled people aren't there. A sign that says a deaf person is in the area, and this kind of ramp that's etched into this staircase. So it's the study of the cultural and social phenomenon of disability. It centers the experiences of disabled people and people with differences, and is focused on examining the historical and contemporary experiences of a variety of disability communities, really from all around the world. So if I was to boil it down, critical disability studies gives us another story of disability, one that is not steeped in the medical or the charity or the pity models, but really is a counter narrative of disability as capacity and as potential. As Dr. Tanya Tichkovsky argues, who's a disability studies scholar at OISE at the University of Toronto, she says disability as life, not just adverse effect. Disability as really part of life. Students who take disability studies courses will learn about disability history. They'll travel back 6,000 years and consider the meaning of disability throughout the ancient world, and how our understanding of disability today has not always been. Disability has not meant the same thing throughout history. This means what's important, why we go back into history, is because it means that we can in fact change our understanding of disability today, because it hasn't always been the same. And here you see two images, one of them from ancient Egypt. This is the god Becht on the left here, and the other one you see an image from ancient Greece, about 300 before Common Era. This is just called Old Woman in Market, but really shows you that people were still thinking about disability and sculpting it at the time. Students will also learn disability theory, the ways disability is conceptualized differently depending on whether you view it as a consequence of the body, of social exclusion, of failed technology, of changes in attitude. And really, theory just provides us with lenses that we can view disability differently depending on which one we can apply. And so this is really this is Disability 101 that you see on your screen here, the medical model and the social model. This person is in a wheelchair, so they have an impairment, right? They have a physical difference, but where really is disability if we were going to point to it in this image? The medical model would say it's in her body. The social model, in fact, points to the stairs as the thing that are, in fact, disabling this person. So you can imagine that when this was, the social model has saved lives. It was revolutionary at the time when it came out in the 80s in Britain, because it doesn't necessarily ask disabled people to change their bodies or to come back to some sort of normalcy. It really asks us to challenge the environments around us that have become disabling to us. Students will also learn the pseudoscience of eugenics as really the leading science in the middle of the 20th century that was so popular, really far outside of Germany. I think people think eugenics, they think Germany, but in Canada up until 1972 in Alberta, we were still sterilizing disabled people. So, 30 years after the war, we were still participating and practicing this form of eugenics. They'll also learn how eugenics continues and really still manifests in our everyday lives and policies when it comes around disabled people to this day. They'll learn the deep history of disability activism in this country and around the world. They'll learn that disabled people occupied buildings for weeks. They went on hunger strikes. They scaled stairs on their stomachs, and they even busted into bathrooms to accost political leaders, all for in order to ensure their rights and entitlements were protected. And so the rights we have today and the ones we enjoy are because of these amazing individuals. Even the simple things like curb cuts. Some of you may know that curb cuts were, in fact, they weren't around. They're, in fact, an invention that was created by disabled people through their activism. They'll also learn to come to understand the importance of representation and the ways that art and culture really impacts on people's perceptions and expectations of disabled people. So in addition to challenging representations of disability in mainstream television, in movies, and in art, students also learn that there is an entire subculture of disability arts that has its own history, aesthetic, and powerful impacts on culture. These two images, one of them is this person in a big sheath doing a dance, a performative arts, and the other person is a disability dancer, part of a very famous group in California called Sins Invalid. The first picture in the PowerPoint is also from Sins Invalid. What students really leave with when they get a disability studies degree is a new understanding of disability, one that is much more complex, and which leads them into a variety of fields and areas of work where they'll hopefully continue to challenge ableist and sanist forces and come to become ambassadors of this counter-narrative disability as part of life. So I'll stop here to ensure we have time for questions. I'll just leave you with one more thought. Disability isn't inherently bad. One may experience pain or loss, even significant change as a consequence of disability or experiencing impairment. But disability is only made more challenging because of the social, cultural, political, and economic conditions that make living in a body or with a mind that's different unacceptable. So accepting disability only really means expanding our definitions of human variation. Disability is really part of our lives. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.